Some men are born into power. Others chase it their entire lives. But very few stand at a crossroads where they must choose between power and salvation. This is the story of a man who ruled an empire feared by thousands, yet secretly dreamed of living a life of faith. A man who could command loyalty with a single word, but struggled to command peace inside his own soul. His name was Marco DeLuca. And for years, he lived two lives. One in the shadows of crime, and one in the quiet light of a church. This is the story of the mafia boss, who might have been a priest. Marco DeLuca was not born into luxury. He grew up in a crowded neighborhood where opportunity was rare and survival was everything. The streets were loud. Arguments echoed through apartment walls, and sirens were a regular part of the night. But inside Marco's home, things were different. His mother was a woman of deep faith. Every Sunday morning, no matter how tired she was, no matter how little money they had, she dressed Marco in his best clothes and took him to church. To her, faith wasn't just belief. It was survival. And young Marco listened carefully to every sermon. While other boys ran through the streets looking for trouble, Marco sat quietly in the wooden pews, watching the priest speak about forgiveness, sacrifice, and purpose. There was something about that life that fascinated him. The calm, the discipline, the idea that a man could dedicate his life to something greater than himself. One day after Mass, the priest called Marco aside. He had noticed something unusual about the boy. "Marco," the priest said softly, "you listen differently than the others." Marco looked confused. "What do you mean?" The priest smiled. "You listen like someone searching for meaning." Then he placed a hand gently on Marco's shoulder. "Have you ever thought about becoming a priest?" For the first time in his life, Marco imagined a different future. A future where he helped people. A future built on faith instead of fear. And for many years, that seemed like the path he would follow. But Marco's life was more complicated than the church knew. His father was not a religious man. In fact, Marco rarely saw him at church at all. His father worked long hours, often returning home late at night. Sometimes with bruised knuckles. Sometimes with large amounts of cash. Marco never asked questions. But as he grew older, he began to understand. His father was connected to something powerful and dangerous. The kind of world where loyalty meant everything, and betrayal meant death. It was a world that existed in shadows, far away from the peaceful sermons Marco heard every Sunday. For years, his mother tried to shield him from it. She hoped the church would guide Marco toward a different life. But the streets have a way of pulling people back. And one night, everything changed. Marco was 17 when he received the phone call. The words came quickly. His father had been killed. A violent dispute between rival families had turned deadly. The man who once controlled half the neighborhood was gone. Just like that. The funeral was crowded. Men in expensive suits stood silently around the grave. They spoke in whispers. And every one of them watched Marco closely. After the ceremony ended, 3 men approached him. Men Marco recognized from childhood. They had worked with his father for years. One of them stepped forward. "Your father built something powerful," he said. Marco remained silent. He protected people. He created opportunities. He commanded respect. The man paused before finishing his sentence. And now someone needs to lead what he started. Marco felt the weight of those words immediately. He shook his head. No. The answer came without hesitation. I'm not part of that world. The men exchanged glances. They didn't argue. They simply nodded and walked away. But Marco quickly learned something important about power. It never disappears. It only waits for someone strong enough to take it. Life after his father's death was difficult. Money became scarce. Bills piled up. The same men who once respected his father began testing the limits of Marco's family. Protection vanished. Threats appeared. And slowly, Marco realized something terrifying. Without power, they were vulnerable. One evening, a man showed up at their apartment demanding money his father supposedly owed. Marco stood between the man and his mother. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar. Anger. And responsibility. That night, Marco went looking for the men who once worked with his father. He found them in a dimly lit restaurant. When he walked in, the room went silent. The same man who spoke at the funeral looked at him carefully. "I thought you didn't want this life," he said. Marco stared back. "I don't." The man leaned back in his chair. "Then why are you here?" Marco answered calmly. "Because my family needs protection." The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then the man smiled slowly. "Your father said you were different," he said. Looks like he was right. That night, Marco made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Not because he wanted power, but because he believed he needed it. At first, Marco only handled small responsibilities. Delivering messages. Managing business disputes. Ensuring agreements were respected. But something unexpected happened. He was good at it. Very good. Unlike many others in that world, Marco didn't rely on violence first. He relied on intelligence, strategy, and patience. He listened more than he spoke. He studied people. And slowly, others began trusting his judgment. Within a few years, Marco had become far more than just another soldier. He had become a leader. Businesses started answering to him. Decisions passed through him. And people began speaking his name with a mixture of respect and fear. By his early 30s, Marco DeLuca controlled an empire his father had only begun to build. Money flowed through dozens of operations. Loyal men stood ready to follow his orders. Rivals thought carefully before challenging him. To the outside world, Marco was now a powerful mafia boss. But there was something no one in that world understood. Every Sunday morning, Marco still went to church. No bodyguards. No expensive suits. No display of power. Just a quiet man sitting in the back row. Listening. Watching. Reflecting. The priest had no idea who Marco had become. To him, Marco was simply a familiar face that returned every week. A man searching for peace. Sometimes Marco stayed after the service ended. Not to confess. Not yet. Just to sit quietly while the church slowly emptied. Because inside those walls, everything felt different. The violence of his world seemed far away. The endless power struggles disappeared. And for a few moments each week, Marco felt something he rarely experienced. Silence. But silence can be dangerous. Because when a man finally stops running, he starts hearing the questions he's been avoiding. And Marco had one question that haunted him constantly. What if he had chosen a different life? Years passed. Marco's empire grew stronger. His reputation spread. but so did the weight inside his mind. Every violent decision left a mark. Every betrayal he ordered. Every enemy who disappeared. The world called him powerful. But power has a price. Late at night, Marco often sat alone in his office. The city lights glowing outside the window. A small cross resting on the wall across from him. A reminder of the life he once imagined. Sometimes he would stare at it for hours, wondering, could a man like him ever truly change? Or had he crossed a line that could never be undone? The question grew louder every year. Until one day, he finally decided to ask it. It was late evening when Marco walked into the church again. The building was almost empty. Only the priest remained, organizing books near the altar. He looked up and smiled when he saw Marco. "You're here late tonight." Marco nodded. "I needed to talk." The priest gestured toward a nearby bench. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marco spoke the words he had carried for years. "Can a man who has done terrible things ever be forgiven?" The priest studied his face carefully. He didn't ask what Marco had done. He didn't demand explanations. Instead, he answered calmly, "Forgiveness is always possible." Marco looked surprised. "Always?" The priest nodded slowly. "But forgiveness requires something most people fear." Marco leaned forward. "What?" The priest answered with a single word. "Sacrifice." Marco understood exactly what that meant. Forgiveness wasn't just about regret. It required change. Real change. And for a man like Marco, change meant something almost impossible. Walking away from everything. The empire. The money. The power. The loyalty of hundreds of men. A mafia boss cannot simply disappear. Leaving that world could create chaos. Or worse, make him a target. For the first time in decades, Marco stood at a true crossroads. One path led to continued power. The other, to redemption. But choosing redemption meant destroying the life he had built. And perhaps risking his own survival. For weeks, Marco said nothing to anyone. But those closest to him noticed something different. He had grown quiet. Thoughtful. As if preparing for a decision no one else could understand. Then one night, Marco DeLuca vanished. No announcement. No warning. His closest advisors woke up to discover their boss was gone. Some believed he had been killed. Others believed he had fled the country. But a few people remembered something strange. On the morning he disappeared, Marco had visited the church one final time. And after that day, no one in the criminal world ever saw him again. Years later, stories still circulate about Marco DeLuca. Some claim he secretly lives in a remote monastery. Others insist he still controls his empire from the shadows. No one truly knows the truth. But his story left behind one powerful question. Can a man who spent his life building an empire of fear truly find redemption? Or does the past always follow us, no matter where we run? Before you go, think about this. If you were in Marco's position, would you choose power or redemption? Let me know in the comments.